The fates of many people who left a bright mark in world history are shrouded in so many mysteries and legends. So many unsolvable questions remain that numerous scientists and enthusiasts still, in spite of all efforts, cannot answer most of them. In this video, we will talk about such mysterious people. I have discovered the secret of building pyramids, so said Edward Litzkalman, Latvian migrant who in 1920 moved to Florida and built the famous Coral Castle, an extremely intriguing and still unsolved mystery. The Coral Castle is a huge wall of coral blocks. They are laid without any cement, perfectly fitted, like in the Egyptian pyramids. Inside are strange towers with a sickle and a month. At 152 centimeters tall, Edward weighed only 44 kilograms and suffered from tuberculosis. Without construction machinery or even a jackhammer, he brought huge blocks of coral limestone from the coast and sawed blocks out of it. Edward was very secretive and worked only at night. Grumpy Ed, as his neighbors nicknamed him, let him into his domain without any particular inclination. He would silently grow behind the uninvited guest and stand silent until he got away. And when they wanted to build a villa near the Coral Castle, Edward simply moved his brainchild to another place 10 miles south, and no one understands how he managed it. It is known that Edward hired a heavy-duty truck that came every morning. The driver would leave for the loading, returning around noon, when the back was already filled with multi-ton coral blocks. No one saw Edward loading or unloading the truck. Neighbors all say that he did not own any trucks or elevators. A few years after Edward's death, an intrigued and American Engineering Society conducted an experiment of their own. They rented a bulldozer and tried to move one of the blocks that Edward hadn't had time to use in construction. But it didn't work. Edward's mystery remained unsolved. The life story of one of the most famous alchemists of the 20th century, who called himself Fulcanelli, is shrouded in mystery and known only from third parties. According to people who never knew him, the alchemist's identity has not been established to this day and remains a mystery to everyone. According to those who were closest to him, Fulcanelli is one of the few who managed to discover the great secret of creating the substance that legends call the Philosopher's Stone. And not just to gain immortality, but to rejuvenate his body, and judging by the books and scientific works he left behind, Fulcanelli was a very erudite and educated man. In the early 20th century, the fame of the French alchemist spread throughout Europe, and the Parisian high society tried, to no avail, to identify the scientist, but after all possible contenders for his role died in occult circles over the following years, the mysteries and doubts about Fulcanelli's identity only increased. The most surprising thing is that those very authoritative people who knew Fulcanelli personally and who became his disciples and promised to keep the alchemist's secret were amazed at how this man maintained his strength and youthfulness at his age. Many have noted that, decades later, Fulcanelli remained virtually unchanged, traveling all over Europe and continuing his research in alchemy. The last reliable testimony of Fulcanelli, dated 1953. The writer Louis Pauwels, sitting in a Parisian cafe, met the famous alchemist, who by that time had grown considerably younger and looked about 35 years old. After that, traces of Fulcanelli are lost. Fulcanelli's followers believe that he reached a higher spiritual enlightenment and, in other words, reached a higher level of being. On November 24, 1971, an unremarkable, thin man, wearing sunglasses and a business suit, boarded a plane from Seattle to Portland. He looked about 40 years old and carried a capacious bag on his shoulder. In those years, no identification was required to buy tickets, so the name on the ticket was written from the citizen's word, and the man identified himself as Dan Cooper. After a safe takeoff, the man surreptitiously handed the stewardess a note. The note said that the plane had been hijacked and that the kidnapper was demanding a ransom of $200,000. The perpetrator opened the bag and showed the frightened stewardess a device with the ends of bare wires and threatened to blow up the plane if the authorities did not comply with his demands. The perpetrator exchanged the passengers for money and, with the rest of the crew on board, the plane flew toward Mexico at a low altitude and a fairly low speed. Dan Cooper sent the stewardess, who finally noticed him taking off his tie and wrapping some ropes around his waist, to the cockpit. From that moment on, no one saw him again. Cooper parachuted from a height of 3,000 meters, taking all the evidence and $200,000 with him. The sketch of the hijacker was given to all local police stations in the area where he landed. In spite of dozens of FBI agents and a thorough search by the military, they found no sign of Cooper, alive or dead, whose name, of course, turned out to be invented. A few weeks after the events described, a letter arrived at a newspaper editorial office from a man who identified himself as Cooper. He explained the robbery of the airline by his desire to live comfortably for the 14 months he had left before he died. Many enthusiasts still believe the legendary man is alive and has managed to beat the FBI. A large-scale search has come to nothing. Over the years, the FBI has found nothing to shed light on the hijacker's fate. Only 9 years later, locals accidentally found 3 bundles of moldy dollar bills on the riverbank a few dozen kilometers from the possible landing site, which matched the numbers of the ones handed over to the perpetrator. 45 years later, the FBI acknowledged their impotence in solving the case and closed it in 2016. American agriculture in the early 20th century was an endless expanse of corn and cotton fields. It was not surprising that farmers were willing to pay any money to shamans and con men of all stripes to bring them the rain they wanted. But among these con artists, one unique individual clearly stood out. At the end of the 19th century, a certain Charles Hatfield appeared in the southern states of the USA. At first, he drove around households and sold sewing machines, and he spent every spare minute in libraries studying physics and chemistry. He wanted to learn how to induce rain. So at the beginning of the 20th century, he obtained a mixture capable of inducing precipitation, and most surprisingly, unlike his fellow outright con artists, Charles's predictions for days ahead were so accurate that at some point no one would risk betting with him on the future weather. The fame went viral in no time. Orders came in droves from all over California. The State Bureau of Meteorology tried to put the success down to a cyclone. Charles responded by signing a contract with the Los Angeles City Council to supply the rain, promising a hefty penalty in the event of failure. The forecasters loudly announced that it would not rain for the next 5 days, but the day after spraying the powder, it rained like a bucket. For each order Charles received phenomenal in those years, thousands and even tens of thousands of dollars. And despite his few failures, Charles, in most cases, literally saved thousands of people from ruin. During his tenure as Lord of the Weather, Hatfield caused more than 500 rains. But Charles took the secret of his powder with him to his grave, and there is not even a hint of where to look for the solution to the mystery in The Cellar of Rain. Many of you have heard of Thomas Pynchon, the writer who has been hiding from all correspondents and admirers for more than half a century. His only photographs date back to the 50s. And what he looks like and where he lives now is kept a closely guarded secret. But perhaps even the mysteries of Pynchon pale in comparison with the next character. A man with an incredible destiny who lived several identities at once. He was best known by the pseudonym Bruno Traven. We can assume that the future writer was born in America to a family of German origin, since Traven preferred to write his books in German. This elusive man so often changed his identity, created his new biography from scratch, that to this day biographers, historians are still struggling to bring all his personalities into a single whole and finally understand who Bruno Traven was in fact. Suggest that the personality of the writer included at least 5 people. Otto Fage, metallurgist and head of the Gelsenkirchen Metalworkers Union at the beginning of the 20th century. Ritma Ruth, theater actor and anarchist who, as a U.S. agent in the 20s, was actively involved in radical revolutionary movements. Torsan, a Mexican restaurateur, photographer, archaeologist, and a respected missionary, Hall Cross, who was introduced in American and European high society as a translator and confidant of Traven. And the writer himself, Bruno Traven, who sent all his works by mail to the publisher. Most of his photographs were mysteriously spoiled or disappeared. A very interesting story happened on the set of the film based on Traven's book The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. For Americans, this film is iconic. Traven, under the persona of Mission Hall Krause, personally visited the shooting of the film and with his charm literally enchanted director John Huston, the legendary actor Humphrey Bogart, and the entire film crew. And what was the surprise of filmmakers and correspondents when this man disappeared immediately after the filming, and only years later, after Traven's death, everyone learned that the author of the famous novel was personally present on the set. To this day, almost every detail of Traven's life is hotly debated, and the question of the writer's true identity will apparently remain forever open. If you liked the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and write what you think about it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support is very important to me.